All right. Excuse me. Get going here in just a second. So, sorry about the last minute room change. I was looking at some of the sessions and realized that they had scheduled our room to be used. So, kind of got that settled yesterday and got us over here. Hopefully. Yeah. Yes, hopefully you guys saw the announcement. If not, hopefully you saw me or you saw other people in here and we kind of get this all figured out. Okay. So before we kind of jump into things, got that current homework out there. Should be able to make a pretty good kind of headway into that or pretty far into that. If you have any questions on that, office hours are kind of as usual. So I'll be there from 2 to 4 today, 2 to 4 tomorrow. I'll also talk or mention Friday. I'll probably be around Friday afternoon, or I shouldn't say I'll be around. I'll be available Friday afternoon. I'm usually around, but I can probably carve out some time to make sure I have a little bit of extra office hours on this Friday. Okay. Any questions for me before we jump into things here today? Okay. So last class, we kind of left off thinking about these shutdown decisions, right? So we said that we kind of had two things we were really focused on. So here was our profit equation. So we said that if the equilibrium price is ever above my average total cost, I know I'll have positive profits. If it's below that, I'll have negative profits. We then said, okay, if the price ever falls below my average variable costs, well, then I'm actually just better off shutting down. But if price is somewhere in between my average total and my average variable costs, I'll still be having negative profits, but I can minimize my losses. Okay. So I guess I could add in one more thing here, which is if price is ever above average total, here we kind of had positive profits. If price is below average total, we had negative profits in kind of two scenarios there. One, we would shut down. The other, kind of stay open but minimize our losses. Okay. That's kind of what we talked about last class. If we think about this was in the short run, right? So that we actually had a difference in between average total and average variable. In the long run, we don't have to worry about this, right? Because in the long run, everything's variable. There's no fixed costs. And so there we're just concerned in the long run, can we get price to be above average total, right? So the long run, how do we get to kind of think about the long run relative to the short run? We know that in the long run, we'll have kind of this equilibrium point where the quantity demand is equal to the quantity supplied, or kind of talked about this looking at like the intersection of our supply and demand curve. Okay. So in the long run, our supply curve is just going to look like that standard supply curve that we've been drawing, right? So I think about, we have this kind of standard supply curve, right? But how does, as the price goes up, right? There's another way to think about why do we see higher and higher quantities provided, okay? So we can kind of think about this in terms of firm entry and exit decisions, right? So it's not like in any good we're thinking about, it's not like one firm is producing all of these quantities. It's usually there's some optimal quantity for a firm to produce, and there's 100 firms producing that. You add that all up and you get market supply, right? So it's not just one firm. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of firms here, right? So as that price goes up, what's the firm's decision going to be, and how does that have an impact on the market? Okay. So we kind of think about this as long as price is above average total cost, the profits are going to be positive. So I've got some stuff in the slides. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, kind of complicated. I don't know. I don't like it as much as being able to do this on the board. So I think the board will kind of help. Okay. So let's assume that we've got some cost structure. So here's my marginal costs. Here's my average total costs. And let's say the current equilibrium price for the firm's marginal revenue is at this point. Okay. Where's the optimal quantity going to be? So how do I determine where the optimal quantity produces, or where will profits be maximum? Yeah. For all these units where the marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, I'll be adding to my profit. I'll stop at the point where they're equal to each other. Okay. So here I've got positive profits, right? And actually, I'm going to save a little bit of room here. So I'm going to write this down over here. So I want to draw something next to this. So I can kind of think about, excuse me, here. Right. So there was some market supply and market demand curve. That's where my equilibrium price was coming from. Okay. So I'm kind of drawing these side to side so that we can see. Here's my market, right? Here's the supply and demand for whatever good this is. Maybe this is gasoline. Here's one individual firm's cost structure. They're taking that equilibrium price as given from whatever the market dictates. I can't, sell gas for $1 more than everybody else. No one's going to buy it from me, right? So I just have to accept that price. Okay? So what's going to happen here is that the current price, call this P1, and my average total cost. My price is above average total cost, so I know that my profits will be positive, right? Yeah, think about that equation over there, right? As long as the price minus average total cost is a positive value, profits are positive. So what do you think companies are going to look at, or potential companies are going to look at this market and say, well, the current firms operating at a point where they're maximizing profits are earning positive profits. So what do you think might happen? More firms enter or exit this industry? Enter, right? If things are good, well, there's going to be more businesses popping up to sell that product. Right? And so what's going to happen if I add more suppliers? My market supply curve. My market supply is just adding up every individual company supply curve. So if I now have more companies, I call this S2. My market supply has increased, right? Just like we said, adding more consumers increases demand, adding more suppliers increases supply. So I get this kind of right shift in my supply curve, right? I've added more people, more firms are entering this market. Well, what's happened to the equilibrium price? Right? Well, now my equilibrium price is a little bit lower. I tried to draw this in a way so we can kind of see. Okay, now where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? It's going to be at a lower quantity for the firm. So we call this like Q2 for the firm. So more people enter the market, it drives the price down, which then kind of drives profits down for all the existing firms.
How does price go down?
Yeah, so as supply goes up, right, our new equilibrium price is being driven down. That's like what we kind of talked about in the past. So think about it as we talked about this before, but the real, I guess, the easy intuitive explanation is, if we think about there's fewer of something, it has a higher value, right? Like art, right? So then if we have a higher supply of something, it has less value. So people are willing to pay less for it. So that's kind of the intuition behind why. The idea is that I add more suppliers. It's really that these quantities can be provided now. Think about, we've got this increasing marginal costs. So if I only had one firm, to go from this quantity to this quantity, I'd have to increase my marginal costs. However, if I've got 100 firms, well, now to add that, maybe I don't have to add that from this firm. I could add it from another firm that has low cost as well. So I can provide more units at a lower cost. Companies at lower cost willing to provide them at a lower price. That's another way of kind of thinking about it. Questions? That's a good question. Questions on that? So we kind of see that in the short run, there's these positive profits. Firms then enter the industry and drive these profits down until they're equal to zero. Because once profits are zero, are there any other firms going to want to enter this industry? No. But there's also not going to be any firms that just want to exit this industry either. So if we have positive profits, we see this increase in supply, decreases the equilibrium price, drives profits down to zero. And we say in the long run, now, are we ever in the long run? This is somewhat of a philosophical question. Probably not, right? We're always kind of progressing, right? But we see this kind of these ebbs and flows where, if we start to see positive profits in industry, they get driven back down to zero over time, right? Now, there's other market factors that can change, right? You can kind of imagine, let's say, okay, we're in the short run, they drove profits down to zero. Nobody's entering or exiting this market. But then all of a sudden, something else changes. So no firms are entering or exit, but all of a sudden, we just see like the baby boom, right? And we see this increase in population, so that we see this huge increase in demand, which will then kind of drive our price back up. Now there's positive profits in this industry again. More firms will enter, driving that profit down to zero, right? So things can still change, and we're never really truly in the long run. But as time progresses, we typically see firms enter and exit markets to drive that profit level down to zero. Okay. Now we'll work through a different scenario. So let's say that we are in the short run. Actually, I'm going to try to stack these graphs again. So I'm going to save a little bit of room here. So let's say I've got something like this. Something like this. Here's kind of my market. Here's my firm. So marginal costs are increasing, intersecting our average total costs, right, at that minimum point. And let's say in the short run, we see this as our equilibrium price, right, which firms will take as marginal revenue. Well, where did this come from? See if I can draw this correctly. You kind of think about this as, here is my equilibrium price, right? The market dictated that price. Firms just take that price as given. It's just now we're in a scenario where that price is below that minimum point on my average total cost curve. So where's my equilibrium quantity? Well, the profit maximizing, or I shouldn't say equilibrium quantity for the firm, or the profit maximizing quantity is always where my marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. Okay. So we'll call this Q1 of the firm. Right. But notice at that quantity, my equilibrium price is below my average total cost. So what's going to happen? Profits are negative, right? If price is below the average total, then when I take the difference between the two, I'm going to get a negative value. So there's negative profits in this industry. So what do you think firms are going to do? Get the hell out of it, right? All right, they're going to start to see certain firms. I think I'll draw this over here because I think it's a big point. So you've got some firms that even here. Draw this out just real quick. So let's just assume you got firm one. Need to draw the minimum point. So here's their average total cost. You don't necessarily have to write this out. I'm kind of want to make a point here. So let's say that I've got one firm and their average variable and average total cost looks something like this. So maybe there's cost differences across different firms. And then I've got another firm. I don't know. Their average variable costs are a little bit lower. So let's say the price was right here. Right. Well, notice at that equilibrium, or sorry, at the profit maximizing quantity, firm one, right? This price is below their average variable cost. So what would that firm do? Look over there. We said anytime the price falls below my average variable cost, I should minimize my losses and shut down. However, firm two, that price may be above their average variable, so they're going to continue to operate minimizing their losses. Well, when one of those firms decides to shut down, what happens to the number of suppliers, the number of producers that I have? Decreases. So what's going to happen to my market supply curve? Fewer people selling a good means we get this kind of decrease or this leftward shift in my supply curve. So firms exit this industry because some of them are forced to shut down at these lower prices. But as firms leave the industry, market supply is going down. What happens to the price? It's pushed back up, right? The new equilibrium price in the market gets pushed back up because there's fewer firms that exist, or there's fewer of these items that are now out there, right? And the ones that remain, right, are the ones that kind of that price was above their average variable costs in the short run. Okay. At this newer price, I try to draw this perfect, but not perfect. I mean, you kind of imagine what I'm getting. It pushes that price up to the point where profits are zero. Now, no firms are going to no more firms will exit the industry. Right? So it doesn't matter like what situation we're in the short run, whether or not we start with some positive or negative profits in the short run, firms will enter and exit this market to drive those profits to zero. Once those profits are zero, there's no incentive for any firm to enter or exit the market. We think about that as we're in the long run, right? We're in the long run equilibrium. Now, like I said, are we ever in the long run? No, because things can always change. But there are moments in time where we get the situation where economic profits are zero and we don't see any firms enter or exit this market. Okay. So those are kind of the steps that we have, right? So both scenarios, we see firms kind of making decisions whether to enter or exit the market that drive our profits down to zero, okay? Any questions over anything here? I think drawing on the board was maybe, I like to kind of stack these next to each other. I've got some slides, I don't think, I think it's harder sometimes to kind of visualize and see this. But, you know, you can kind of imagine if I start out with this green supply curve where the equilibrium price is above my average total cost, I had positive profits. Kind of what was the value of profits? We ended last class at the very end, kind of saying if I had values, like if I had like a grid line here and I could figure out these values, and basically just plug in the equilibrium quantity, the price, and the average total cost, and I can calculate what the actual value of profits are. Here, because price was above average total, I know that I had positive profits. If I have positive profits, firms enter the industry, driving that market supply curve up or increasing it. I say up, it's kind of, you said the supply curve is kind of difficult because increases in the supply curve look like it's shifting down. But I said the better way to think about this, increases in supply kind of push it to the right. So an increase, my supply curve is more firms enter, drives down the equilibrium price until that price is exactly equal to average total cost, and we get profits being equal to zero, right, in the long run. Another way of thinking about this is, and it's kind of, we'll think about this as we can calculate some profit levels here. So let's say I've got my market supply, my market demand curve, and the current equilibrium price is $18. So I then look at my individual firm, what's their equilibrium quantity? Well, where does that marginal revenue, so that equilibrium price of $18 hit my marginal cost curve? Up there at point E. So my equilibrium quantity would be 5, right? I then have kind of this equilibrium price. I have my kind of optimal quantity for the firm. Those are two of the things I need to calculate profits. The only other thing that I would need is where I'm at on the average total cost curve, right? So I think here that's 14.4. Now, if those were my profits, I'll go back. I just want to show you that 14.4 to kind of show you can grab that value from the graph and then calculate what the value of the positive profit is. If there's positive profits, though, more firms enter this market, driving the price down. And you kind of think about that green area, that difference, well, here. So that difference between my price and my average total cost, that would have been the height of this rectangle, right? So the difference between price and average total cost is like that height of the rectangle visually. What's the width of that rectangle? Well, it starts at 0 and it goes out to whatever that optimal quantity is. So finding the area of this rectangle, taking the optimal quantity, multiplying that by the difference between, price and average total cost. Well, the area of that rectangle is literally my profit equation, right? So thinking about visually, that rectangle represents the amount of profit that this firm's earning. So they've got pretty large profits. People see this, they're like, I want to get on that. So if more firms enter this market, they drive the price down. At this new price, the firm's like, well, okay, price is now lower, but it's still above average total cost, right? So even though the area, kind of this yellow kind of bar area, that's my new profits after the firms have entered, right? So they drove the price down, which kind of ate into my profits a little bit. You can kind of see visually that rectangle that's kind of yellow there, much smaller than it was before, right? But profits are still positive. So what happens? More firms enter the market until they drive the price all the way down to where price is equal to average total cost and the firm no longer has any positive economic profits. And so I thought this is maybe a little bit convoluted. I kind of like showing it like I did up here on the board just to make it a little bit.
Is that how it works in the real world? Is that what happens?
Yeah, so if you think about it, I mean, I would say if we have a perfectly competitive market, this is for sure what we see, right? If we think about somewhere like, I think gas stations are, for me, the closest to a perfectly competitive market you can think about, because the product is homogeneous, right? I mean, I don't know, someone might like BP gas more than Shell. I've heard reasons, I don't understand why. But the idea is that they're selling the same product. Nobody can get away with selling that for a little bit higher, right? Because if you try to increase the price by 10 cents, you're just going to go to the next gas station that's on the next corner, right? So what do you see? As industries see higher and higher populations, what happens to my demand curve? Gets pushed up, driving that equilibrium price up. Well, now there's positive profits to be made. So what happened? I no longer have one gas station in a town. I see somebody else build one down the street. And then, as I add more and more of those, it's driving the profits down to 0. As soon as the profits are driven down to 0, well, no other gas stations are built, right? And so a lot of times, like small towns, you can kind of think about them like they're usually often in the long run equilibrium, right? Because whatever the demand is in that town, like there's only ever going to be enough profits or kind of firms will be earning positive profits only if there's like one gas station in town. As soon as that second one would kind of build in that town, it would drive the price down enough to where now everybody's negative profit. So there will never be a second firm added in, right? So we do see it play out. It's not the most, I would say it's not the most common because we have market structure issues. So the other types of markets we'll talk about are not perfectly competitive, where we have this homogeneous product and tons of buyers, tons of sellers. We've got monopolies where you just have one seller of a good. You've got oligopolies where you've got like a few, right? And then you've got monopolistically competitive where this is kind of like gas stations. They've tried to push away from a perfectly competitive market to what we call a monopolistically competitive market by building up their brand, right? By building some type of brand loyalty that people aren't just valuing the good they sell, they're valuing the brand, right? That they like, earn reward points or whatever these other things are. Right? Other question that was good. Sorry, I went a little bit of a side there. We haven't talked about those other types of markets yet. For now, we're just under this perfectly competitive kind of world.
It's kind of scaring me a little bit.
It's really the same type of principles that will apply to those markets. we just think about now the firms have a little bit of power over the consumers. So if firms have a little bit more power over the consumers, what do you think probably happens as we move away from a perfectly competitive market? Firms are able to charge higher prices. Yep, and that's really the summary of what we'll talk about in those other, like, I mean, it works in a different way and we have to think about it slightly, but like the end result is that moving away from a perfectly competitive market just drives prices up for consumers. So that's why, we see, we'll talk about that. I'm going off on a tangent a little bit here, but the idea is we don't like to see anything other than perfectly competitive markets because that we know it'll hurt consumers. It'll drive prices up. All right. So another way we can think about this is, if I had existing kind of firms in the market, I kind of already went through this on the board, or I have mentioned this at this point, but we don't always have to see firms entering or exiting, right? Potentially we're at this point where whatever market supply and market demand were, profits are exactly equal to zero, right? At that profit maximizing quantity, price and average total cost are the same. Okay? But if we see a boost in demand, right? So there, firms haven't entered or exit. We were at this profit point of zero, and all of a sudden, just for whatever reason, demand increases. Maybe the price of a substitute good goes up. Maybe the price of a complementary good goes down. Maybe income for a normal good has went up. Like all these different changes we said that could impact the demand curve, something happens. So demand gets driven up for this product. Previously, we had zero profits, but after demand increases, our price is now higher. Right? So we now think about, well, what's the level of profits now? We identify kind of that equilibrium quantity. At that equilibrium quantity, our price is now above average total cost. No, I don't have a visual here. So price is above average total. We would now have kind of positive profits there, right? So it's not just supply changes that can kind of impact the firm, but also demand changes as well. Any other questions? So I kind of skipped ahead here a little bit. So I see this demand change. I didn't even hit that too many times. So we see this demand increase, drives profits up. What's the response to that by firms? Well, now there's positive profits. So firms enter the market. We see a increase in supply. The new equilibrium price gets driven back down to what it was before, where we now have positive profits. So in the short run, when firms enter, they can experience these positive economic profits in the short run, but as firms enter this market, they're eventually driven down to zero. So what's probably always good to do, or who's going to benefit the most when we see these demand increases? So we think about, we have this demand increase, firms enter the market, but as firms enter the market, the profits get driven back down to zero. So it's always better to be what firms when you're entering this market? It's always best to be the first firm, right? Because as you enter the market, you're just eating into the profits that are available. So if I'm the very last firm that enters this market, so that I drive the supply down to this point where profits are zero, well, I missed out, right? But if I was one of those first firms in the short run, and I was the first firm that you kind of mentioned, just a little bit of an increase in supply, well, now I've entered this market. Yeah, I drove the price down a little bit, but profits are still positive. But then another firm enters. Supply gets driven up a little bit more. They've kind of eaten into the current. So it's always good to be kind of those early firms that enter the market. Because if you're the last firm that enters the market, you get in there and now you're like, well, there were positive profits, but now I've driven them down to zero. So I kind of could have joined this market or not, and I'd be in the same position. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions kind of about this more? I don't know, any broad questions or anything before we kind of keep moving here? Tried to kind of show it in a couple different ways and think about really what it stems from is just these shifts in our market's supply and demand curve, which is stuff that we've already talked about. And then those shifts will affect our equilibrium price, which is then going to impact the optimal decision for the firm.
So if you were a firm, would you want to stay in, even though like profits are zero, might go down into like negative, knowing that people are going to leave, or did you want to leave? Like,
yeah.
Sticking on.
So you're thinking about if I was at a point where profits are zero, or are you thinking about if profits are negative?
Yeah, like say you join in the middle of the pack and then it keeps going down, and then you're like, okay, should I stick this out?
Yeah. So what can happen? Not super likely, but possible, right? Where's my red marker? So let's say firms are, go this in the opposite direction. So firms are entering this market, right? Driving up supply. Well, maybe there's like this huge over response. They drive the price down really low. In fact, they drive it down so low that they've now created negative profits in this industry. Well, what's going to end up happening is then at these negative profits, now firms will start exiting the market. What does this look like in practice? Let me think of a good example here. Maybe a town where you start to see more and more restaurants pop up. And then all of a sudden, the 2 or 3 newest restaurants in town, all of a sudden are out of business. Why? Because there wasn't enough demand, right? So all these new restaurants were like, well, the 2 existing restaurants are making positive profits. I'm going to start my own. I'm going to get in on this. But if 4 or 5 people do that all at once, well, now they've driven supply up enough to where that equilibrium price is driven down. Now there's negative profits. And so those kind of last few restaurants that open will then typically be the ones you kind of see also then drop out of the market pretty quickly as well. All right. So you can't have this over response where you went from an industry that had positive profits to where you've got too many new suppliers and you actually now see negative profits. Well, what's the result of that? Then some of those start to leave the industry. So it's this constant ebb and flow. Like it's really difficult. Like I said, it's almost a philosophical question of when we're in the long run, because really we're never going to experience the long run in the sense of things are always changing. Right. So, but to your point, right, you could see enough firms enter where they've now created an industry where there's negative profit, and then some of them would have to leave. Or I shouldn't say they have to, but some of them will decide to leave. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah.
Is that why small businesses tend not to work out a lot?
There's a myriad of reasons why probably small businesses don't work, but I would say one of them probably is the smaller the business, the harder it is to understand market conditions. You don't have an entire division that's able to evaluate what the current demand is, right? And so a lot of small businesses are really, I mean, not to be rude, but like, it's someone who has a good idea, right? Or sees that there's an issue, there's positive profits, but they might not really understand that, yeah, there's positive profits for this one restaurant in town, but as soon as there's a second restaurant, there's not enough demand for both of them to survive, right? And so I think a lot of it is that small businesses probably aren't evaluating correctly whatever the current market supply and demand are. And they don't really think about what their influence over that market supply curve is going to be, and that potentially joining this industry, well, once I'm in, now I've driven the profits to be negative, and someone's going to have to leave, probably going to be the newest firm. Because, yeah, does that, like I said, there's a ton of other issues as well, but I would say that probably is one of the major ones. They're just not evaluating their influence over the market supply and supply curve. All right, so you kind of think about in the short run, we might see the supply curve. What ends up being true is that in the long run supply curve is a little bit flatter. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we're not going to hammer this idea too much. But the idea is that when would supply be perfectly inelastic? Right, this kind of just to relate to some stuff that we've already talked about. This was one of the questions on the exam was, when is demand perfectly inelastic and what does that look like? So does anybody remember kind of, we have perfectly inelastic demand, it would be the same kind of thing, we have perfectly inelastic supply. My supply curve would be what? Straight up and down, right? Because changes in the price aren't influencing that quantity supplied at all. So when are we more elastic? When we have more time to make a decision, right? When more firms can decide, do we enter or exit this market? So that long run supply curve starts to look a lot less vertical, right? I'm using the extreme case here to point out perfect inelasticity. As we have more time moving to the short and the long run, we can make more decisions. We can be more responsive. So we get something that's less vertical or more horizontal. Okay? So that's kind of just relating this idea to stuff we've already talked about. I'm not going to hammer this too much, but the long run supply, basically, we can be more elastic. So we're going to see it be a little bit flatter. Firms have more time to kind of make a decision about whether or not they're entering or exiting this market. I don't know. That's not too much more I really want to say about this, other than kind of relating that to the idea of the elasticity. That in the long run, we're going to see kind of this more horizontal supply curve. So what I really wanted to kind of get to was this idea of, if we're thinking about the long run, we have something called economies and diseconomies of scale. Now, what this looks like is, I'll try to set up an example here. So let's say I'm a company and I'm trying to make a decision about how large I want my production facility to be, right? So my factory or whatever it is. Well, I can choose buildings of different sizes. The problem is that takes time. So in the short run, I may be in this really small production facility, which has a little bit higher costs. Now, ideally, I would like to move to this medium kind of size facility because it allows me to be more efficient, it allows me to drive down my costs a little bit. And you can kind of see if I could move to that medium facility, my new average total cost curve is going to be like lower, right? But I can only do that in the long run. And then I could think about, well, I could even go to an even larger facility, but maybe, I don't need that much room. I'm actually paying for more than what I'm actually benefiting. And so maybe moving to that larger facility, I actually then drive my costs up, right? So there's going to be like this sweet spot, I guess like kind of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Like I'm kind of trying to find that middle point where my production facility isn't too small, but it's also not too large, okay? So in the long run, I can choose between these three different production facilities. In the short run, I'm stuck with wherever I'm at, right? I have to kind of use the average total cost curve that I'm currently facing, but I would like to decrease that average total cost curve by moving to different production facilities, in this case, from a small to a medium. Right? So when we think about, excuse me, we can produce similar quantities at all of these, right? So if I'm producing at a quantity that's below this QA, which is kind of a cutoff quantity, notice where would I like to be? Well, if I'm at any quantity below here, my average total costs in the small facility are actually less than the average total cost in that medium facility. I'm just thinking about if I was at the same quantity, average total costs are lower on this blue line than on the green line. So if I'm producing low quantities, I'd want to be on this blue cost curve, small production facility. If I ever want to then kind of continue to produce past this point, well, now at these quantities, if I remain in the small facility, my average total costs are greater than the average total cost if I move to that medium facility. So in the long run, if I ever want to produce past this point, I'll want to move production facilities. And then kind of keep going. If I want to move past this point, we'll notice at these quantities, the medium production facility costs were lower than the large. But if I ever want to produce more than this QB cutoff, well, now I actually want to transition to that large production facility because the average total cost of that large production facility in those quantity ranges is now below that of the medium. So as we see kind of things progress over time, firms will only ever be on these portions of the average total cost curve, right? Now, they may have to move production facilities to kind of move along that line, but that's where we would be, right? So you can kind of think about it as, and I already said all this, my long run average total cost curve is going to be kind of like every time I get an intersection of these average total costs, like I'm just moving to the next average total cost curve. And I only have 3 here, but you can imagine I could have 50 different production facilities, right? So it might look something like this, right? Where I've got all these different cost curves and I'm moving kind of along the minimum points of all of them, right? Now, excuse me, this long run average total cost curve really just looks like an average total cost curve now, right? It's got kind of this U shape to it, right? So it doesn't really change any of our decision-making processes, right? Because we still have this U-shaped average total cost curve. It's just that it's going to take time for us to kind of get to that minimum point, right? To move production facilities, becoming more and more efficient to kind of achieve that lowest average total cost possible. Why do we want average total cost to be as low as possible? Because if the price of the good is staying the same, right, and I'm just driving down my average total cost, I'm creating more profits. So within the same industry, maybe certain firms face different costs, but they can still only sell at that equilibrium price. So it's always better to be the firm that has the lower cost structure. Right? Any questions on that before we keep moving? We on time, okay. So a couple of things we want to talk about with the average total cost curve, which are how to identify economies, diseconomies of scale. So the idea of economies of scale is just that as I ramp up my production, as I produce more, I'm driving my costs down, right? Which is a good thing, right? I want to be driving my average total cost down because that's going to increase profits. Okay? So this initial portion where as I produce higher quantities, I'm kind of like, I'll show here, shifting, right, to these lower average total cost curves. This portion of my long run average total cost, we're saying I'm experiencing economies of scale. By producing more, I'm driving my per unit costs down. So it's a good thing, right? This is the idea that, initially by producing more, I'm kind of spreading my costs out over more and more units, right? Now there's this weird kind of portion in the middle, and usually I'll say something about this in just a second. I'll explain it and then I'll say what it looks like in practice. This portion in the middle we would call constant returns to scale. As I'm increasing my quantity here, I'm not moving to any higher or lower costs, right? So there, I'm really indifferent between producing those quantities because I'm not really changing my cost, my average total cost at all. My profits are remaining the same. And then we have this last portion, which is we call diseconomies of scale, that by producing more, well, now I've gotten to a point where, okay, yeah, initially I was spreading my costs out over more units, but as I produce more and more, I have to start relying on less and less efficient workers, less and less efficient materials. So eventually I get to these quantities where if I want to continue to produce more, I'm actually just going to be raising my average per unit cost, right? So we would call that diseconomies of scale. So you can imagine if I'm ever on the diseconomies of scale portion of my long run average total cost curve, I'm not going to want to kind of continue to increase my production, right? I'm going to want to stay at one of these quantities here. Now, if I'm ever on the economies of scale portion, well, then I do want to keep producing more because I'm just lowering my average total costs and increasing my profits. Okay. So we've kind of got these three portions of the demand curve. Has some when economies of scale kick in, your average total cost decreases. I don't know. I just found this online. I kind of figured out they're in here, but this is the real takeaway, right? We want to be on that economies of scale portion where as we increase production, we're driving down our per unit costs. Now, the one thing I did want to mention is this constant range. I drew it very exaggerated here. In practice, my long run average total cost probably looks something like this, to where like it doesn't really ever have a flat point. There's just going to be kind of like this really, really an infinitesimally small number of units where like I would have that constant. It's probably like would be something like a range of 1 unit, right? That constant economies of scale portion is likely really, really small, right? But I drew it here so we can kind of actually visually see that it does exist. It's just that in practice, it's generally quite a bit smaller than the economies of scale and the diseconomies of scale portion of our long run average total cost curve. Any questions on this? We keep going here. All right. So what does our long run equilibrium look like? Okay. So in the long run, kind of throwing everything together here. Okay. In the long run, question. In the long run, we want to get to this lowest point. Here, I'll throw the lowest point on this long run average total cost curve, or move production facilities, or however we're thinking about these things that are fixed in the short run. We want to change them in a way that we can get to this lowest possible average total cost curve. So in the long run, we will have driven our average total cost curve, our short run average total cost curve, down to this minimum point of our long run average total cost curve. Well, marginal cost intersects those at their minimum point. That hasn't changed. It's just like what we were talking about before. And in the long run, we said profits are 0, right? Firms enter and exit in the short run. To the long run, we get that profit level driven down to 0. So we know that the equilibrium price in the long run should be hitting our long run average total cost curve right at its minimum point. Because if it wasn't, right, we think about this price being higher, right, the price is up here, well, then maybe it makes more sense to be on one of these short run average total cost curves. Profits will be positive, firms enter, drives the price down, we shift right to these others, right? We would kind of shift back to this point, then more profits are equal to zero, right? So the same kind of things would happen. It's just kind of throwing it all together here. In the long run, our cost, like if you ignore the long run average total cost curve, everything looks exactly the same as what we were doing before. It's just that whatever short run average total cost curve we're going to be at, it's at that minimum point of our long run average total cost curve. And we know that in the long run, firms will have entered and exited this industry to drive profits down to zero. So we have this, like, in the long run, the price is the same as the average total cost, which is the same as the marginal revenue, which is the same as the marginal cost. And it's also at the minimum point on our long run average total cost curve, right? All these things end up being the same in our long run equilibrium. Okay. So I think I've got like a conclusion slide here. We're just kind of wrap this up. So in a perfectly competitive market, right, we are kind of assuming, and I mentioned a little bit about this, that it could vary, but in all these models, we've kind of assumed that all firms are facing the same marginal cost structure. It doesn't have to be the case. If it's not the case, we start to move into some of these other markets that aren't perfectly competitive. So really, to be truly perfectly competitive, we're assuming that all firms are facing the same cost. Because of that, if there exists positive profits, we'll see firms enter. If we see negative profits, firms will decide to leave. As firms enter and exit, this drives us down to where profits are equal to zero, where we get this long run market equilibrium where everybody's earning zero economic profits, right? We kind of talked about there's differences between economic and accounting profits, but in the long run, we'll see economic profits driven down to zero. Okay? So before we get out of here, you guys are pretty interactive today. Saw a lot of people paying attention. So I'll give you guys credit for kind of showing up. Whatever letter today, just kind of get you recorded for attendance on your way out. The other thing I'll mention is we'll start with monopolies on Friday. But like I said, you should be able to make a pretty good dent into that homework. And I would start working on those. It's kind of follows the flow of the class. So the first, half of questions you should be able to get pretty far into before we kind of start moving into additional topics. Okay. All right. So make sure you get a response report for the iClicker on before you leave. Other than that, I will see you guys on Friday.